The builder used just about all the square footage in the footprint of the house. There is this one little area that I can milk a little more storage out of. The project has 4 parts. First, I need to cut a hole in this wall. Then I need to reframe a bit to support a cabinet. I need to build that cabinet. And then I want to build something that covers the cabinet, so what I store in there is hidden. I have construction photos, so I know there's no wires behind here, and I know that it's framed with 3 studs on the left and 2 studs on the right. By the way, if you like that mirrored tile, I have a video on how I installed it. It's actually a much bigger space than the floor plan would lead you to believe, but I'm only going to be using a small part of it. Next step is to build a shelf to support the cabinet. It's nothing fancy. I'm using for the most part leftover lumber. The top is a 2x12 cut to length and width. The back part of the shelf is going to sit directly on concrete, so I'm using pressure treated lumber for that. The front legs of the shelf are not pressure treated. They're not going to be in contact with concrete, and I'm securing those directly to the existing framing. So when I put the shelf in, I can secure the front to basically what is the framing of the house. And then to help secure the back, I'm adding another 2x4 and screwing diagonally into that. Next step is to build the cabinet. I use this website free where you can enter the dimensions of your plywood, enter the dimensions of all the cuts you need, and it will give you an efficient layout. I'm using 1/2-inch birch plywood. The cabinet's going to be about 44 inches tall, 11 inches wide, 18 inches deep, with a fixed shelf in the middle and then 2 adjustable shelves top and bottom. I have never made a cabinet with adjustable shelves. I did some research, found this jig on Amazon. I'll link it in the description. It ended up working really well. It's very easy to space the holes as deep into the board as you want. It comes with a drill bit where you can set the depth of the hole. And this particular jig was for 1/4-inch shelf pins. I'm only showing you one set of holes, but you repeat this pattern on the near and far sides of both the left and right panels. I'm going to paint this cabinet, and it's easier to do it in parts before assembly. My painting procedure is to give everything a light sand, then put on a coat of primer, sand again after the primer, and then put on at least 2 coats of paint. For assembly, I'm going to be using glue and screws. I taped off the edges that are going to be glued so that the glue would stick wood to wood instead of paint to paint or paint to wood. The procedure here is to apply glue to the panels, get them clamped up and square, then pre-drill because we're only dealing with 1/2-inch plywood and we don't want it to split, and then screw into those drilled holes. You can get a better finish on cabinets if you use a paint sprayer, and I have a paint sprayer. I'm just terrible at using it. I can never get the right consistency, the right air pressure. Maybe it's a bad paint sprayer, maybe it's user error, but if you were doing a lot of cabinet work and you're willing to put in the time to get good at it, I think a paint sprayer achieves a much better result than a roller. It also makes it much easier to paint inside a cabinet. So after I get this assembled, I'm going to caulk all the joints and then paint them, which would be a breeze with a sprayer, but a little bit harder with a roller. The shelves are made out of the same 1/2-inch plywood, but to hide the plywood edge and to give the shelves a little bit of a beefier look, I've glued on a 3/4-inch strip of pine. Because this cabinet is so tall, I'm using a fixed shelf in the middle to give it some more stability. It's a little tricky to get the screws right because the plywood is so thin. I'm using a spacer board to make that a little bit easier. We need a face frame for the cabinet, but because the cabinet's going to be hidden behind something, we don't want it to be bulky. I'm running it through the table saw to make it narrow, and then a few passes through the planer to make it thinner. Assembly of the face frame is just glue and clamps. After that, I give it a quick sand and a couple coats of paint. I'm going to attach the face frame to the cabinet with glue and screws. So as a first step, I'm using a pocket hole jig to drill pocket holes all around where the face frame is going to attach. After that, I spread glue all around the cabinet and use a ridiculous number of clamps to clamp the face frame to the cabinet. You could use the pocket hole screws as the clamping pressure, but I find that if you screw while the glue is still wet, you run the risk that the face frame will move. So what I prefer to do is let the glue dry and then put all the pocket screws in afterwards. The left side of this opening is framed with 3 studs, the right only 2, so I need to add some additional framing that will give me something to nail to when I put the cabinet in. The cabinet is very stable on the shelf and fits snugly between the framing, so I'm only going to secure it with 4 nails. Last step is to build something to cover the cabinet. I have this fence wood that I've used for prior projects. These are panels I made for the coffered ceiling in the foyer, which is also where this cabinet sits. So I'm going to use that same fence wood to create a similar design, basically a panel that we can hang over top the cabinet. This is another piece of that 1/2-inch birch plywood. It's about 15 inches wide, 4 feet tall. It's painted white on one side, and I stained it brown on this side in case you can see through any gaps in the fence wood. I'm putting gel stain on some of the plywood, and these will serve as inserts into the panel. So that's what the front looks like, but to give it some depth and to help hide the face frame of the cabinet, I'm nailing thin strips of fence wood around the border. We're coming up on the most frustrating part of the project. What I really wanted was for this panel to hinge open in front of the cabinet. I did a ton of research into hinges, I tried a few, I just couldn't find a way to make it work. If you guys know a way, I'd love to hear it in the comments, and I'll make a follow-up video where I change this picture hanging hook into a hinge. Oh, and I do recognize the irony of making a secret cabinet and then putting it on the internet. Don't rob me.